So, dear colleagues, before I begin this presentation, I want to remember my dear colleague Norbert Goslar, who died 4 weeks ago at the museum in Berlin due to a sudden heart failure. In the last 3 years, we have worked very closely together on the material from the Prussia collection, from the former Prussia Museum in Königsberg. And however, in this way, I want to remember and honor Norbert not only for his great archaeological work, but most of all for his great personality. He will be missed very much. Nevertheless, this presentation deals with new research on the famous site of Linkuhnen. Linkuhnen was excavated between 1928 and 1939, but was never really published. Linkuhnen is a cemetery that was in use from the 2nd to the 11th century. First of all, I would like to give you an overview on the basic features of the site, and secondly, I will discuss some aspects of the Viking Age graves in Linkuhnen and the meaning of Linkuhnen for the Viking long-distance trade and the communication between the Baltic, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe. You will see that Linkuhnen really is a very interesting site. Even though the cemetery in Linkuhnen was in use for a period of roughly 1,000 years, it is most famous for its finds from the Viking Age. Over 80 years after the first excavation at Linkuhnen, this is the first attempt to reconsider the archaeological results of this site on a broader scale. This study is part of a project founded 2011 to 2014 by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft (DFG) that worked on the medieval material culture in East Prussia from the collection of the former Prussia Museum in Königsberg, now in the inventory of the Museum of Pre- and Proto-History in Berlin. You will find the data sets of 9,800 medieval objects of the Prussia collection online for research. When you go to this address here, and then you will also find the Viking Age objects from Linkuhnen if you search for Linkuhnen there. For more information about the project and the history of the Prussia collection, you might as well go to this address, because the history of the Prussia collection will be a lecture of its own, so we don't have the time to go into detail into this. But this is all in German now, so maybe we'll manage to do some English version. So, but now we're going to start with Linkuhnen. The village of Linkuhnen is located about 10 kilometers west of Tilsit, now Soviets, in the Kaliningrad Oblast in Russia, and 4.5 kilometers southwest of the modern course of the Memel River, on a small sandy terrace running from northwest to southeast, a few meters above the marshy plains of the Memel lowlands. The archaeological results of the excavations at Linkuhnen became a subject of political interpretation and national concern during the dispute about the Memel territory between Germany and Lithuania after World War I. So this area here. With its close position to the Memel River, Linkuhnen was misused to deliver archaeological arguments for territorial claims from Germans and Lithuanians. We have to keep this historical context in mind when we read the few publications about Linkuhnen from Karl Engel, the excavator of the site. It is obvious that Karl Engel tried to overemphasize the importance of the Scandinavian influence on the grave goods material in Linkuhnen for political reasons against Lithuania even before 1933. So, in the north of Linkuhnen, the remains of the former course of the Memel River here is still visible. The geographical situation of the Linkuhnen cemetery, located on a terrace above the former course of the Memel River, was of strategic importance and represents a key element for the interpretation of the site. The position of the cemetery within the village can be located rather precisely on the basis of the archival information, but there are also 3 spots with settlement character dating from the Neolithic to the Viking Age. So the spots 4, 5, and 6. We know not very much about the settlements, but it's very likely that this is the place where the local population lived and which directly relates to the cemetery. A few pits and some architectural structures were found in the late 1920s. It's obvious that there are no signs for any kind of Viking settlement. All settlement finds are rather of local character. Okay, you see here a picture of excavation in 1930, and you see actually how small the excavation area really was. The area that had been excavated between 1928 and 1939 covered a surface that was only slightly bigger than 50 by 50 meters. You see the scale here. This is 50 meters. But it's obvious that the excavation took place in the core of the cemetery, but never covered it completely. Most probably, the cemetery extends further to the west, somewhere here, and to the south. The occurrence of surface finds outside the excavation area led to the assumption by Karl Engel that the fieldwork only covered about 25% of the cemetery area. Between 1928 and 1939, a total number of 492 inhumation and cremation burials with approximately 5,500 grave goods were excavated from the Linkuhnen cemetery. The chronological spectrum of the grave goods indicates a continuous usage of the cemetery from the Roman Iron Age and the migration period to the Middle Ages, so the 2nd to 11th century. Today we have information about 348 graves, with details regarding burial rites, grave constructions, and, most important, the grave goods. 144 graves lack any information whatsoever, but we have precise location of 175 graves within the cemetery. On the basis of this information, the timing of the archaeological events in Linkuhnen can be reconstructed in this way, that you see the different trenches of the different campaigns, starting 1928, so on the right side, and then going to the western side, and this is actually the way to the farmhouse of the farmer Stuhlema, somewhere there. And the settlement excavations in 3 years, 1928, 1930, and 1933. But as I said, there's very little information about the settlement. Compared to the huge amount of archaeological material that came to light between 1928 and 1939, the published results by Karl Engel only showed a tiny fraction of the complex structure of this site. Moreover, his descriptions and conclusions are based on the limited results of the campaigns in 1929, 1930, and 31. At that time, only 134 of the 492 graves had been excavated at that time. Karl Engel only published a few scientific articles about the Linkuhnen cemetery, but he started an intensive press and public relation work to present Linkuhnen as a Viking-related graveyard to the German public against Lithuania. With a series of newspaper articles, Engel made Linkuhnen a well-known archaeological site in East Prussia and other parts of Germany at the end of the 1920s. So you see here, in these newspaper articles, it's always Viking weapons. He even said Linkuhnen is sort of East Prussian Troy. And it was a very intense public relations campaign. So the excavation was always full of visitors, even after Karl Engel left the Prussia Museum in 1934. With the beginning of World War II, the last campaign in Linkuhnen was stopped at the 1st of September 1939. So, what do we actually know now about Linkuhnen? The re-evaluation of Linkuhnen began with the construction of the catalogue of finds. Today, 302 objects from Linkuhnen are preserved in Berlin, but most of these objects, 202 pieces, have been re-identified through various archival sources and assigned to their archaeological context. So we only have about 100 objects which are nicely labeled like this and even have some writing on it, but most of the objects are like this one, no labels and no signs that they are from Linkuhnen. They have been re-identified either through some of the articles or through the archival material. And it is the combination of information from the objects in Berlin and the various archival material that opens up the possibility for a new approach to the archaeological importance of the Linkuhnen cemetery. Today, the catalogue of finds include almost 4,000 objects. Most of them can be related to their grave context. 129 pieces are single finds, 10 objects originate from the settlement area, 6 objects belong to the Ascheplatz, and only 27 pieces are lacking any information. Since the vast majority of the finds described in the archival material can be assigned to their context and carry typological information, many objects can be utilized for chronological discussion, even if they are lost today. In this way, the grave goods and burial rites during the long duration of the Linkuhnen cemetery can be reconstructed rather comprehensively. Based on the excavation reports, the graves in Linkuhnen contained an average amount of about 11 grave goods during the 1,000 years of existence of the cemetery. Transposed to the 144 graves that lack any information, you can assume an additional number of 1,600 objects, and therefore most probably about 5,500 objects had been excavated between 1928 and 1939. The key element for the reconstruction of the excavations at Linkuhnen lies in the numerous archival information. To show you just a few examples, you see here the inventory books of the Römisch-Germanische Zentralmuseum, RGZM in Mainz, here. In 1930, the RGZM made copies of 117 objects from the excavation campaign of 1928, when the young Herbert Jan conducted the first excavation at the cemetery together with the local museum from Tilsit. And even though the actual copies are lost today, these objects were documented very well within the inventory books of the RGZM and are nowadays of great use. But we also have some fragments of the original field documentation here, of the original field diary of different campaigns. So, before we discuss the Viking Age, a few words about the chronology at Linkuhnen. What you see here is the excavation situation in 1931 with 3 different layers of graves. When we talk about Viking Age at Linkuhnen, we talk about cremation graves from the most upper levels. So, this one here. Engel described the site of Linkuhnen as a cemetery with 3 or 4 floors of occupancy. He took these floors or levels as successive phases of occupancy and was taking of a model in which these layers represent stratigraphic units on top of each other. So, The lower level, inhumation graves, the black ones here. The middle layer, the blue one, older cremation graves, and the two upper layers, 3 and 4, younger cremation graves. Sometimes these two are on top of each other, and this is the Viking phase we are looking for. You see how dense this cemetery in some areas are, and yeah, it must have been a really difficult task to excavate this cemetery. The same idea in a different way. You see the inhumation graves in these wooden coffins and the cremation graves in these little wooden boxes. Karl Engel was right in his assumption that there are different phases of occupancy at Linkuhnen. Nevertheless, our new survey on the old finds from Linkuhnen now allows for a more accurate picture. Basically, it can be said that there probably was a continuous occupancy from the 2nd to the 11th century. If we try to synchronize Linkuhnen with the actual chronology of the East Baltic, the beginning of the occupancy is still a part of the end of the older Roman Iron Age. Here. The first peak of occupancy is reached during the migration period, and the maximum of occupancy can be clearly noticed in the Viking Age. So phase 2 and 3 correlate with the lowest chronological level after Engel. 3 and 4, no, 2 and 3, 3 and 4 is the middle phase, and 6 and 7 belong to the upper levels. But not all the graves will fit perfectly into this model. There are also some few cremation graves at the lower level and some inhumation graves at the middle and upper level. Also, the distinction between the phases are not always that sharp. If we want to have a look at the Viking Age material, we actually have to start at the end of phase 5. If we take the phases 5, 6, and 7 together as representative of the Viking Age, these phases represent over 50% of the graves at Linkuhnen. This one here. So, entering phase 5, cremations are now dominating burial right. Inhumation graves occur only in a sporadic way. For the first time, we can observe that in some graves, the cremated bones, together with selected grave goods, were wrapped in woven fabric and then put into wooden caskets. The new spectrum of fibulars from phase 5 consists of brooches with animal head-shaped foot of types Orbeck 198 to 200. Yeah. Pin jewelry and hairpins show now new forms as well, pins with double spiral and disc-shaped heads. A local feature is represented by hairpins with mushroom-shaped heads and the upper part of the shaft with rivets here. Sometimes these pins were deformed before they got into the grave. At phase 5, we also meet massive spiral neck rings made of twisted wire for the first time, as well as larger amounts of massive cast bracelets. Chain elements continue to grow in scope and include conical beads made of spiral bronze wire here. The weaponry from the graves consists of single-edged swords with a simple shape, normally several spearheads, for the first time spurs, as well as horse bits. So the following phase 6 is a hypothetical one, which could be inserted between the main occupancy phase of the cemetery starting in the 10th century. Phase 6 consists of a few cremation graves with only weaponry. Significant for these weapon graves is the fact that for the first time we find ended swords, which can be classified according to the typology of Jan Petersen. The weapons show only single-edged blades. From phase 6 on, more than one sword, as well as an average between 3 and 4 spearheads go into the graves. New typological elements within the weaponry are slim lance heads of type E after Petersen. Their sockets often show an ornament in form of pointed arches. Concerning riding equipment, there are stirrups as new elements. Also cruciform disc brooches and spiral bracelets are new within the costume elements. The maximum of occupancy at Linkuhnen lies clearly in the last stage of the cemetery, phase 7, which can be divided into 2 subphases A and B. Cremation burial rite is dominant, only 2 inhumation graves are known. The cremation graves often contain larger concentration of cremated bones. A quarter of them were wrapped in a woven fabric and then put into a wooden casket, together with other selected grave goods. Some of these caskets showed coffin-like dimensions, and now the ensembles of grave goods are becoming very rich, but it's still difficult to separate between female and male outfits, except for the weapons. A few graves features, already noticed by Engel, suggest that complexes with a large amount of cremated bones and rich furniture of grave goods could be taken as collective graves with more than one buried individual. The spectrum of costume elements includes types like the large crossbow fibulars with ring decoration, cruciform disc brooches, fibulars with animal head-shaped fruit pins with double spiral heads, mushroom-shaped heads. Here, also new elements are found like glandular brooches with rolled up and animal head-shaped and polyhedral terminals. Further, the latest form of crossbow ladder fibulars of type Orwerk 196 and 197. Then we have larger pins with tetragonal shafts, as well as glass beads with eye motifs. This set is completed with abundant ring and chain jewelry. Miniature,
please.
okay. Miniature objects from the field of textile production, like small tablets of weaving, spindles, and distaffs, some of them which with bird-shaped hammers, also new animals in phase 7. Phase 7b, that's material that really can be linked to the 11th century, and they represent the end of the usage of the cemetery. Okay. What's really interesting about Linkuhnen is that if you take a closer look at the weaponry, there are swords with single or two edged blades, and up to 8 swords can be found in one grave. It is significant that sword types S, T, V, X, and Y, after Petersen typology, which were introduced at Linkuhnen during the 7th century, apparently show no more single-edged blades. Regarding the older types E, H, I, and S, which go back to the 9th century, there are single-edged examples as well as double-edged ones. Among the spearheads, of which there were found up to 20 examples in one grave, type E after Petersen is the dominant form, often with a pointed arch ornament on its socket. Only in one grave an X was discovered. Riding equipment consists of horse bits, stirrups, and spurs. So, the most outstanding phenomenon at Linkuhnen is the massive representation of swords. We have 143 swords and their fragments from 70 graves of the 9th and 11th century, and 9 swords of the Ulfberg type. So this means Linkuhnen is the site with the highest number of Ulfberg blades in Europe. You see pictures of Ulfberg blade like this. So the question is, what about the Scandinavian influence elements of the material culture in Linkuhnen? To make this a little bit short, we have some links to Gotland. If we look at the spearheads type E, we have this decorated spearhead from grave 4, which links directly to Gotland. Maybe this spearhead of type M. We have this disc brooch, which relates to Birka, and we have this fragment of an oval brooch from Linkuhnen, which could be compared to oval brooches also from Birka. So the actual real Scandinavian influence is not that very big. Much more significant is the influence from the neighboring Curonian region in the north. A lot of the elements here that we find, in Linkuhnen are have good parallels within the Curonian nearby cemeteries. And crucial to the interpretation of Linkuhnen is the cemetery of Bischwil, about 40 kilometers east from Linkuhnen, at the bank of the Memel River. At the moment, we know about 2 Viking Age cemeteries from that site associated with the settlement, which show not only the same inventory but the same burial rite as we find in Linkuhnen. But still, Linkuhnen has the bigger inventories, especially if you look at the Ulfbed as well. So the written sources from the period of the Teutonic Order ascribe the region along the Memel River to the tribe of the Scaldians. The center of this correspondent countryside lay near Tilsit and Ragnit, from where we also know Viking Age weaponry. So the burial rites and grave furniture show many specific patterns. At the same time, these communities were involved in a supra-regional network between the whole Baltic region and furthermore also between Western and Northern Europe. So the position of Linkuhnen is really just like a junction between Prussian and Curonian settlement regions, and so a junction between north, east, and west. Research before 1945 believed that the cemetery of Linkuhnen was just like Viskyauten, with an existence of Scandinavian trade location, but it looks more now that Linkuhnen is more like a strategic checkpoint for controlling the transit across the Memel River. All the different branches of the Memel River unite at the site of Linkuhnen, and this means that early shipping traffic from the Curonian split had to pass the location of Linkuhnen regardless of which way was chosen to get into the river system. The same is true the other way around. When the ships went back to Scandinavia, Linkuhnen was the last station or the last stop to get to Viking, for example. So we have Linkuhnen here. During the Viking Age, the Memel route was one of the main passages for the trade and transit between Viking Scandinavia and the East Slavonic Empire of Hebrew and Rus. So it's likely that the people of Linkuhnen tried to participate in the flow of trade goods via the Memel River and supplied the Vikings with food and water. The richness of such burial grounds like Linkuhnen or Bischwil is significantly the result of fees and tributes which local tribes elites collected from super-regional transit passing their territory. But even though the Viking traffic left an impressive mark on the Linkuhnen cemetery, at the same time the cultural impact somehow remains sort of superficial. So to end this presentation, the conclusions, you see, Linkuhnen is a cemetery with over 1,000 years of occupancy. The Viking Age is represented in phases 5 to 7. Linkuhnen is a strategic checkpoint for controlling the transit across the Memel and one of the main passages for trade and transit between Viking Scandinavia, East Slavonic Empire of Kiev Rus, and all streams of the Memel Delta meet at Linkuhnen. We see an impressive representation of Viking Age weapons, 143 swords from 70 graves with 9 Ulfbert blades. But the Viking impact meets a distinct local Curonian tradition, and we see very few real Viking finds. Karl Engel's emphasis on the Viking influence at Linkuhnen was partly politically motivated and must be treated with some reservation. And the outlook for further research is that the archaeological heritage of the former East Prussia still holds enormous potential for international archaeological research in Poland, Russia, Lithuania, and the Baltic states, Scandinavia, and Germany. So thank you for your attention.